Now that we know exactly how we get our gametes, we need to talk about the processes that go on so that these gametes can come together and eventually make a zygote that will eventually become an embryo, then a fetus, then a new baby. So what we're going to first go over is the male and female reproductive organs and structures and exactly what the gametes are doing in these particular organs and structures. The EOC is going to expect you to know these major male and female reproductive structures. When we talk about the male, you're going to need to know about the testes, the scrotum, the seminal vesicle, the prostate glands, the vas deferens, urethra, and epididymis, and exactly what role they play in gamete formation and carrying the gamete out of the body. In the females, we have the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, or what we refer to as the oviduct, then the uterus and the cervix. And both of these have some similarities and differences. We have both the testes and the ovaries are going to be where our gametes are going to be first formed and created, and in the females, the ovaries is actually where our female gametes are going to be stored. However, in the males, our male gametes are going to actually be formed in the testes in a tiny little structure that we call the seminiferous tubules, and they will leave the seminiferous tubules and make their way to this structure called the epididymis. And the epididymis is actually where the male gametes are going to mature and be stored. So make sure you keep that in mind. Male gametes are made in the testes, in the seminiferous tubules in the testes, and they are stored in the epididymis. Whereas in the female's gametes are made in the ovaries, they are also stored in the ovaries. The pathway out of the body for a female is the female gametes must leave the ovaries via the fallopian tubes. They'll make their way into the uterus where they will wait to be fertilized. If they are fertilized, the zygote will then develop into a blastula that will implant itself into the uterus and develop into an embryo, then a fetus, and then a baby. And then that baby will be pushed through the cervix and through the birth canal and take its first breath of air and begin its new life. In the males, like I said before, the male gametes are stored over there in the epididymis, and then once they get the signal that they're ready to be used, they're going to be rushed through the vas deferens, and we have a couple glands, the prostate gland, the seminal vesicle, as well as another gland we call the bulbourethral gland, that are all going to secrete nutrients and proteins and mucus protection for these male gametes as they make their way out of the body and into the female reproductive organs in hopes of fertilizing a female gamete. And so again, the vas deferens is where the male gametes leave when they leave the epididymis, and then they leave the vas deferens and the body via what we call the urethra. So I'm going to do a little diagram so you guys can understand these a little bit better. So what we're going to start with here is the major male reproductive organ, which we call the testes. And the testes is going to contain some very tiny, tightly coiled little tubules that we're going to refer to as the seminiferous tubules. Now, one of the important things about the testes is where male gametes are formed. This is where they begin going through meiosis. This is where we have that germ layer. And I'm trying to draw these coils so you can get an idea of what they look like. But they're very, very coiled. And in these coils, this is what we call the seminiferous tubules. And this is where male gametes are formed. And in here we have our germ layer that will never go away. Once a male hits puberty, that germ layer begins going through mitosis first to generate some cells that will then go through meiosis to become gametes. So we can write in here germ layer just so that you remember that's what we have there forever. And gamete formation begins at puberty. So you want to remember the seminiferous tubules, which are located inside of the testes. The testes is the entire structure. And another important thing to understand is these testes are held in a very thin sac that is actually outside the body, and that thin sac outside the body is what we refer to as the scrotum. And that's really important because it actually keeps these male gametes cool, which enables them to survive. So if the male gametes were kept inside of the body, then it would be a temperature of 98.6, which is very hot, very warm, and the male gametes wouldn't survive. Keeps male, gametes cool. Okay, it's located outside the body. So we have the seminiferous tubules here, which is where our little male gametes are being formed, and then they're actually going to make their way, once they're created, once they're formed, they're going to leave the seminiferous tubules, and then they're going to actually mature and be stored in another series of tubules. And I represented this by the red. And we call these tubules the epididymis. And the epididymis is really important because this is where the male gametes, this is where the male gametes will mature. They will get bigger. They'll actually get some mitochondria. They'll get their flagella. The flagella to help them move when they do need to leave the body. Let's get mitochondria. And then they're also going to be stored here. So this is once they're done maturing, they're going to be stored here. So really important for you to remember, epididymis is where the male gametes are stored. That always likes to come up on an interim assessment or a EOC question, just about where male gametes are stored versus the seminiferous tubules, which is where gametes are formed. So in our epididymis, we have our male gametes are stored here, and then eventually they're going to leave, and I'll go ahead and use another color for this. When it is time for the male gametes to leave, they get the signal that it is time to leave the body and try to fertilize a female gamete. They will leave through a series of tubes. The first tube that they will make their way out of, and I'm trying to draw that right here for you. It's a tube that actually extends all the way up into the abdomen, and we call this tube the vas deferens. And the vas deferens is the beginning, the first initial pathway out of the body. So pathway for male gametes to leave the body. And as they make their way up, and this extends all the way up into the abdomen, so we'll put up to the abdomen, which is your lower stomach. So the vas deferens, like I said, extends up into the abdomen, and it's going to come all the way back down and around. And I don't want this to look like it's connected, but let's go ahead and color this structure a different color. We want to have this structure right here, which we're all familiar with, is what we call our bladder. And that's where urine is stored and formed. And then extending from our bladder is a tube that carries urine out of the body. So we'll put out of the body. So this is the exit out of the body. And this tube that carries urine as well as male gametes out of the body is called the urethra. And so it is connected to the bladder. So what's important to understand is that our vas deferens comes all the way around and actually ends up connecting with our urethra. So we can make a little connection right there so you can see how it connects. And then our gametes, if these were our male gametes making their way through the vas deferens, they would end up coming over here, meeting up through the urethra, and this is how they exit the body. Now, there's a couple other important structures that you need to know in the male reproductive system, and these are some glands, and these glands are found throughout the reproductive tract, and one of those glands is really important, and I'm just going to draw some over here. One of those glands is what we call the seminal vesicle. There's another gland called the prostate gland, and there's another gland called, and these locations aren't exact right here, but just so you get the idea that these glands are going to be secreting fluids and secretions into this pathway out of the body. We have another gland called the bulbourethral gland. So we have these three really important glands, and the main function of the glands is to secrete fluids, a couple different important fluids that are going to help carry our male gametes, these little red guys, out of the body. And those fluids are going to include a fructose solution, and we should remember what fructose is. Fructose is a sugar, and that's actually going to be food for our male gametes on their journey out of the body. So they need that fructose so they can get some energy as they make their way out of the body. It's also going to contain some protein for them to make their way out. That's going to help nourish the male gametes. And it's also going to contain some basic, it's going to have a basic pH, which is important. We'll put basic pH here. And that basic pH is going to help neutralize the acidic environment inside of the female reproductive organs. Environment in females. So that's what we see going on over here. So these glands, and we can write them over here, three important glands. And this is going to be our seminal vesicles. It will also include our prostate gland. And it will also include our bulbourethral gland. And all three of these are going to be important in making what we call seminal fluid. And that seminal fluid is going to contain fructose. It will contain proteins, and it will also contain a basic mucus. And when I say basic, mucus. When I say basic, I literally mean the pH-wise basic. So, and the seminal fluid plus the male gametes, so plus these male gametes together is what we refer to as semen. So that's the seminal fluid plus the male gametes, and you can write that down somewhere. Seminal fluid from our three glands plus gametes. And that is what is needed to carry the male gametes out of the body. And here's just a quick overview of everything we just diagrammed out on the board. Basically, the testes, which is stored in the scrotum, which is outside of the body to keep the temperature cool, contains the seminiferous tubules where our male gametes are produced. Then they make their way over to the epididymis where they mature, they get their flagella, they get their mitochondria, then they're stored until they get the signal to be released, go up the vas deferens, and then they're going to make their way into the urethra. In the whole time, the prostate gland, the seminal vesicle, as well as the bulbourethral gland have been adding seminal fluid and nutrients to help carry the male gametes out of the body via the urethra. Now, what I like about this picture is it actually gives you an idea of what the inside of those seminiferous tubules that make up the testes look like, and what exactly that germ layer is that I told you guys about before. When we talked about the seminiferous tubules, it was all of these tightly coiled tubes here inside of the testes where the male gametes were formed. If we were actually to look inside one of them, this is what we would see. And this is what we call, obviously closest to the actual tube, the outermost layer is a layer that's going to constantly be producing new cells that will undergo meiosis. That outer layer of cells is what we call the germ layer. So these are going to be diploid. They're going to divide by mitosis, and one of them will stay there. The next one that it made through mitosis is going to go ahead and go through meiosis till it eventually becomes a male gamete. And that's important to understand because that germ layer will always be there. And so that's just a good picture. Hopefully it helps you envision a little bit better how this male gamete formation occurs. Just make sure you review these terms: testes, seminiferous tubules, epididymis, vas deferens, urethra, and what each of them, or what role each of them play in male gamete formation and helping carry the male gametes out of the body to the female gametes and ultimately to fertilization. So our female reproductive system is the next one we're going to go into. And we really did already spend some time discussing this in the meiosis lecture. We understand that the ovaries is where the female gametes are made and stored. And the ovaries are going to be where the gametes are produced before the female is even born. It's where the gametes are going to be stored, and this is where the gametes are going to be released once the female reaches puberty. Now, an important thing to remember again, we release all these, the release of gametes is controlled by hormones. The ovary produces a hormone called estrogen that stimulates the release of these gametes. And so what tells the ovary to release estrogen? It is going to be some hormones such as the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, which are actually released by the pituitary gland, which is actually all the way up in your brain. So that's just a little background information as far as how your brain is actually the one sending out all these hormonal controls to the rest of your body. So back to our female reproductive system. All right, so our female gamete production and journey through the body and out of the body to fertilization is going to begin over here in what we call our ovary. And the ovary is the female's reproductive, what we call gonad. When we talk about gonads, there's two types. There's the ovary, and the ovary is going to release a hormone called estrogen, which stimulates the release of the oocytes. Then we have the males, which we have the testes, which we already talked about, and the hormone that the testes will release will actually be testosterone. So what exactly causes these two to start secreting their hormones? And that's going to actually be two hormones called the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And these two hormones are actually controlled by what we call the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is nowhere near our reproductive organs. It's actually in our structure called the brain. So our pituitary gland, which controls the release of these two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, once those are released, they'll go all the way to the ovaries, to the testes. They'll cause estrogen to be released. They'll cause testosterone to be released. Once estrogen's released, the female gamete from the ovary will make its way into its journey out of the body. And that's what we're going to look at right now. So we have our ovary. Important for you to know that structure. Our ovary, when a female is born, is going to contain over at birth. It will contain over 1 million cells. And those cells are going to include what we call follicle cells, and then those cells that we call our primary oocytes. And our primary oocytes are going to be the ones that will eventually go through these primary oocytes, the ones that are actually frozen in prophase 1, and they will eventually end up going through, if they get fertilized, meiosis 2 and end up becoming a baby. So at birth, over 1 million cells, follicle cells, and primary oocytes. At puberty, there's roughly 400,000 of these left. And not all of them are going to develop into oocytes. Actually, only 400 oocytes end up being released by the ovary. So those are some good numbers to know right there. Only 400 oocytes in a female's lifetime are released by the ovary. What happened to the rest of those? They actually just disintegrate. They're broken down back into macromolecules that the body can reuse. All right, so let's go back over here. We know we have inside all these oocytes frozen in meiosis 1. Now the next structure, this is our ovary. The next important structure we need to know about is how the female gamete is going to get out of the ovary and enter into, okay, the rest of her journey out of the body. So this is what we call our fallopian tube or oviduct. Can be referred to as both, fallopian tube or oviduct. And what's important to remember about that is this is where fertilization most frequently occurs. Most frequently occurs. So most people think it occurs in the uterus. It's actually in the fallopian tube, usually right around here somewhere. And then it's going to continue on and make its way to the next structure, which we call the uterus. And we'll go ahead and put our uterus in here so we can see what's going on. So here is, this would be our uterus. And then what's important to understand is there's another ovary over here. So we have 2 ovaries, not just one, and they each are going to be releasing these oocytes, taking turns sometimes at different times. So let's come back over here. We have, okay, some signals. Let's say we get some signals from the brain. Hormones come over, tell the ovary that they need to release their primary oocyte. So what we're actually going to get, I'm going to go ahead and draw these follicle cells. And I'm not going to draw all of them. I'm just going to draw it around. But we have all these follicle cells that are actually surrounding what we call our primary oocyte. And this is the one that is frozen in meiosis 1. It has not finished meiosis 1 yet. As soon as it leaves, it will finish meiosis 1, and we end up with, this is what we call our first polar body, and we know that's just going to disintegrate. Polar body. And then what's going to end up happening is this is now our secondary oocyte. Remember now this secondary oocyte has 46 chromosomes. Now all these this red is our follicle cells. And you can think of those follicle cells as the protectors of the oocyte. They protect and nourish the oocyte on her journey out of the body. So what's going to happen is they're going to make their way over here into further up the fallopian tube. And this is important because if there is a male gamete present, this is where they'll meet. Now, if there's no male gamete present, what's going to end up happening is they'll wait about 2 to 3 days over here in the fallopian tube, 2 to 3 days waiting to get fertilized. And if she does not get fertilized, she basically runs out of nutrients. She can't survive anymore. And basically, all these cells are providing nutrients. They've given that oocyte all the nutrients they have. She can't survive anymore. She hasn't gotten fertilized, and she'll literally make her way out of the body. And then this brain will send another signal for the next oocyte in here to be released. So let's go back up here now, and let's assume that there were some male gametes that made their way into the female reproductive tract. Now remember, these male gametes, if we look at the male gametes, they actually have a very strong flagella, okay, to help propel them forward. They also have some enzymes here in this part of the cell. There's some enzymes that will actually help break through this barrier in the female's gamete, in the follicle cells. So let's say a male gamete does meet the female gamete. As soon as they meet, you can kind of think of an invisible barrier being put up. Okay, so as soon as they meet, this invisible barrier gets put up so that no matter what, if any of those other males want to try and get in, they can't. It's impossible. That lucky guy right there is the one who got in. Now, as soon as he touches these follicle cells, a signal is sent to this secondary oocyte to finish meiosis 2. So that means it'll divide until, and we're going to change her right here. They'll finish meiosis 1, so that what we end up being left with is a cell that contains 23. This is a usable female gamete. And then we have the 3 small polar bodies that don't get used. And then finally, the male gamete will actually meet the female. And we'll go ahead and draw that over here. We have our male gamete that finally meets the female with his 23. And when they fuse, we end up getting what we call a new cell that has, let's erase this here. This is our new cell with 46 chromosomes. Okay, this was fertilization. Now we have a new cell that has 46 chromosomes. We call that new cell a zygote, and we've heard that word before. And that zygote will continue to go through multiple stages of mitosis, and it'll become what we call a morula, which is a dense ball of cells. And then that morula will become a blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. Okay, and then that blastula will eventually implant itself in the uterus. And, okay, blastula implants in the uterus. Okay, that's the structure. That's this big structure here. This is the uterus. This is where the blastula implants. Once it implants, that blastula is getting glucose and oxygen from the mother. So that blastula can go through what we call gastrulation. And once it goes through gastrulation, it becomes it's going to become an embryo. That embryo will then become a fetus. That fetus will become a baby, and then that baby will be born. So that all happened if a male gamete was present. And like I said, if there's no male gamete present, none of that's going to happen. The female gamete lost her chance to finish meiosis 2 and leaves the body. And we're going to be going over the stages of embryological development next. So again, just a quick overview, we have our ovary where our female gametes are produced, stored, and then once they hit puberty, once every 28 days, they get the hormonal signal that will cause one of the female gametes and all the surrounding follicle cells to be released. They make their way up the fallopian tube. When they're in the fallopian tube, they'll wait here. And most of the time, fertilization will occur in the fallopian tube. If the male gametes are present, and like we said before, there's always multiple male gametes, they will reach the follicle cells that are actually surrounding our female gamete. Once one male gamete touches those follicle cells, immediately the female gamete will complete meiosis 2, and so we'll be left with one ovum and 3 polar bodies which are not used. Eventually the male gamete will finally reach the female gamete. They'll fuse to make a zygote, that 46-celled zygote. That zygote will divide into 2, 4, 8, 16, so on, and it goes from being a zygote to what we call a it'll go from a zygote to a morula to a blastula. Eventually, once it becomes a blastula, it will attach itself into the uterus wall, which is right here, and then it has a nice supply of nutrients and oxygen, and from there it will develop, it'll go through what we call gastrulation, which we'll talk about later, and develop from into an embryo, which will then develop into a fetus and then into a baby. If that female gamete is not fertilized, it will continue to make its way down into the uterus. If fertilization has not occurred, it will then be released by the body unfertilized, and then another female gamete will be released from the ovary to start the process all over again.